Richard Cross had spent his entire career as a land surveyor, a man who understood the weight of precise measurements, legal boundaries, and the immutable lines that divided one property from another. At 58, he had finally retired, choosing to settle in a house he had meticulously selected years ago, one that sat on a peaceful stretch of land at the outskirts of a small town. It wasn't just a house to him, it was the culmination of decades of careful planning, a place where he could finally enjoy the silence he had long craved. He had spent years working in urban developments, watching homeowners fight bitter battles over inches of land, disputes that could turn neighbors into lifelong enemies. He knew better than anyone how vital it was to have everything in order, to ensure that no one could ever question what was his. That was why, before purchasing the property, he had cross-referenced every historical map, triple-checked the title, and even gone so far as to conduct his own private survey before signing the final deed. His land was his, legally and indisputably. At least that was what he thought. From the very first day he moved in, Karen Ellis made her presence known. She was an older woman in her mid-60s with sharp, calculating eyes and the kind of forced politeness that barely masked something more sinister beneath the surface. She lived in the house next door, though next door in this rural area meant that her property line was still a good 100 feet away from his own. On his second day in the house, she had appeared at his fence, smiling warmly, a plate of homemade cookies in her hands. The conversation had started off pleasant enough, filled with the usual neighborly chatter about the weather and the quietness of the area, but it quickly turned into something else. She spoke about how her family had lived on this land for generations, how she had seen so many changes over the years, and how her late husband had always insisted that the property lines weren't drawn correctly when the town expanded. Richard had politely nodded along, not yet realizing the significance of what she was saying. It wasn't until she casually mentioned that her son, Danny, was looking to build a house of his own that he felt the first twinge of unease. She gestured toward a section of his yard, the farthest corner, where the land sloped slightly downward and offered a natural separation from the rest of the property, and said, "That's where we always planned for him to build, before all these new property laws got in the way." She laughed lightly, as if it were nothing, as if she were simply reminiscing about the past. But Richard didn't miss the way her eyes lingered on that section of land, as if it still belonged to her. He had responded in the only way he knew how, calmly but firmly. "I had everything surveyed before I bought the place," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "There's no mistake about the property lines." Karen had given him a pleasant smile, though something in her expression had cooled. "Oh, of course. I'm sure the paperwork says that. But you know how things were back then. Boundaries weren't always recorded properly. And memories, well, sometimes they hold more truth than what's written on paper." Richard had ended the conversation soon after, chalking it up to nothing more than an old woman's nostalgic ramblings. But something about it unsettled him. It wasn't the first time he had heard of disputes over land, but usually these things happened when there was actual ambiguity, when old deeds conflicted with new surveys. His property had no such issues. It was clear, documented, and legally sound. Still, something about Karen's tone had made it clear that she wasn't just making small talk. Over the next few days, she continued to bring up the topic, always in passing, always with that same light-hearted but insistent tone. She would wave at him from her porch and call out, "Danny's been looking at house plans. He's so eager to move back here." Or she would mention how she had been looking through old family records, finding old photos of the land before all these official maps came in and changed everything. Then, a week later, Richard noticed something strange. The metal markers that indicated his property lines, the ones that had been placed during his survey, were missing. Not all of them, just a few, specifically the ones that bordered Karen's land. He frowned, walking the perimeter, his boots crunching against the dry earth. He knew exactly where the markers had been. He had checked them when he moved in, making sure everything was intact, and now they were gone. He didn't confront her immediately, not wanting to start an argument over something that could have been an accident. But as he examined the ground, he noticed something else, small stakes, wooden ones, driven into the dirt a few feet closer to his house. They were subtle, almost easy to miss, but they hadn't been there before. His first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Maybe someone else had been marking something. Maybe the stakes had nothing to do with him. But as he stood there, staring at the altered boundary, he heard Karen's voice behind him. "I had someone come out to take a look," she said, her tone casual, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. "Just an informal check, just to make sure everything's as it should be." Richard turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You had someone survey my property." Karen waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, I wouldn't call it a survey. Just a second opinion. Sometimes these things get confused. The town's grown a lot over the years. Things shift." He had dealt with enough property disputes in his career to know what was happening. She was testing him, seeing how much she could push before he reacted. He knew better than to engage in a direct confrontation. People like Karen thrived on manipulation, on twisting words and turning simple disagreements into complicated legal battles. That night he went inside and pulled out his documents, his deed, his survey reports, every official record that confirmed his ownership. Everything was airtight. She had no claim. But deep down he knew this wasn't over. People like Karen didn't just let things go. The next morning he found something even more disturbing. A section of his fence, the one closest to Karen's property, had been partially dismantled. A few panels had been loosened, almost as if someone had started taking them down but stopped midway. He checked the ground and saw footprints, not his own, leading from her yard to his. That same afternoon, an envelope arrived in his mailbox with no return address. Inside was a printed notice from the local zoning office. A request had been filed for a review of his property boundaries. The applicant? Karen Ellis. Richard exhaled slowly, gripping the letter tightly. It had begun. Richard sat at his kitchen table, the zoning notice spread out in front of him, his fingers pressed against his temples as he took a slow breath. He had dealt with land disputes before, but never on the receiving end, never as the target of someone who was willing to bend reality to suit their own agenda. The language in the notice was vague, filled with standard legal phrasing, but the intent behind it was clear. Karen was trying to establish doubt, to make it seem like the boundaries of his property were questionable enough to warrant official review. If she succeeded, even temporarily, she could create a bureaucratic nightmare for him: delays, hearings, endless back and forth with the local offices, all designed to wear him down. He had seen cases like this before, where a simple request turned into months of legal headaches, often ending with the rightful owner paying thousands in legal fees just to prove what had already been established. The tactic wasn't to win outright, but to exhaust the other party until they conceded out of sheer frustration. He didn't waste time. The next morning he drove straight to the zoning office, stepping into the outdated municipal building that smelled of old paper and industrial cleaner. A tired-looking clerk sat behind a desk, barely glancing up as he approached. Richard placed the notice down in front of her, keeping his voice calm and professional. "I need to speak with someone about this boundary review request," he said. The woman adjusted her glasses, scanning the document before typing something into her computer. "Applicant is Karen Ellis," she muttered. "Filed last week. Looks like it's under preliminary review." "Who approved it for review?" he asked. "There's no basis for this. My property boundaries were officially surveyed before I purchased the land. Nothing has changed." The clerk gave him a tired shrug. "It doesn't need to have merit to be reviewed. Anyone can file a request if they claim there's a discrepancy. It just means an inspector will come out and take a look, maybe pull up some old records." Richard clenched his jaw. "And how long does that take?" She sighed. "Depends. Could be a few weeks, could be a few months. You'll get a notice when a site visit is scheduled." He knew what that meant. His land would be under scrutiny, and while it was under review, any development or modifications he wanted to make could be frozen. He had no plans for major construction, but that wasn't the point. The point was control. If Karen could drag this out long enough, she could push him closer to giving up, selling, or at the very least, making some kind of compromise that would work in her favor. Before leaving, he requested a full copy of her submission. When he received the printed documents, he scanned them quickly, his pulse tightening as he read her justification. She claimed that historical records. indicated the boundary lines had shifted over time and that her family had always considered a portion of his land to be part of their property. There was no evidence, no concrete documents, just vague assertions and references to local history. He drove straight to his attorney's office. Kimberly Sloan had handled property cases for years, and when he placed the documents in front of her, she skimmed through them, her expression unreadable. "She's playing a long game," she finally said, setting the papers down. "She doesn't need to prove she's right. She just needs to make it difficult enough for you to stay here." "So what do we do?" Richard asked. "We respond with hard facts," she said. "I'll draft a formal opposition citing your legal survey and deed. That should slow her down. But I'm telling you now, she won't back off just because she knows she can't win in court. This is about pressure. She's waiting for you to make a mistake, get angry, retaliate. Do something she can use against you." Richard nodded. He had seen too many people lose cases not because they were wrong, but because they reacted emotionally, giving the other party the ammunition they needed. He wouldn't make that mistake. Over the next few days, Karen's tactics escalated. It started small trash cans tipped over in his driveway, deep scratches appearing on his mailbox, as if someone had dragged a sharp object across it. Then came the letters. First, it was a friendly note in his mailbox, written in looping, old-fashioned cursive. "Richard, I really think we should settle this like adults. I'd hate to see this turn into something nasty." Then, a few days later, another letter arrived, this one less polite. "The town has always known where the real boundary is. People talk. Maybe you should think about what kind of reputation you want in this neighborhood." Richard ignored them, keeping copies for his attorney. But the real test came one afternoon when he arrived home to find a group of men standing in his yard, measuring tape in hand. They were dressed like contractors, wearing heavy boots and utility belts, but he hadn't hired anyone. He parked his truck and stepped out, approaching them calmly. "Can I help you?" One of the men, a broad-shouldered guy with a clipboard, barely looked up. "We're here to do some preliminary assessments, just checking the land measurements." Richard's stomach tightened. "Who hired you?" The man flipped through his papers, then shrugged. "Karen Ellis. She said we had permission to check the lot lines before starting work on her son's future house." Richard exhaled slowly. "You don't have permission. You're on my property. Pack up your things and leave." The man gave a half smile, like he had expected resistance but didn't care. "No problem. We'll just confirm with the town office and come back when it's sorted out." Richard didn't respond. He simply stood there, watching as they gathered their equipment and walked off, heading back to Karen's house. She was waiting on her porch, sipping a cup of tea, as if she were watching a casual afternoon event. She lifted her hand in a small wave. Richard didn't wave back. That night he reinforced his fence, checking every panel, every lock. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he wasn't going to sit back and let her encroach on his land. He double-checked the security lights around his property and went to bed with the uneasy feeling that this was far from over. His instincts were right. The next morning, he stepped outside and found tire tracks cutting across the edge of his lawn. Someone had driven onto his property during the night. And then, as he walked toward the fence, he saw it. A new sign had been planted in the ground right near where the property markers had been removed. It was a simple wooden stake with a laminated sheet attached to it. In bold, black letters it read, "Property dispute pending. Land boundary under review." And beneath that, in smaller text, "Do not trespass without authorization from the Ellis family." Richard stared at the sign, his jaw tightening. Karen wasn't just pushing boundaries anymore. She was claiming them. Richard stood in front of the sign, reading the words over and over, feeling his pulse slow and steady even as something sharp and simmering built inside him. He had known Karen wouldn't back down easily, but this was a step further than he had expected, a blatant move meant to establish ownership over land that wasn't hers. It wasn't just a provocation, it was an attempt to rewrite reality. If anyone unfamiliar with the situation saw that sign, they would assume there was a legitimate dispute, that maybe Karen's claims had some legal weight. It was psychological warfare, the kind designed to create uncertainty, not just in Richard's mind, but in the minds of anyone watching. He exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. Reacting impulsively was exactly what she wanted. She wanted him to get angry, to rip the sign out, maybe even confront her directly. She wanted a reason to escalate. Instead, he turned away, heading back into his house, his movements slow, deliberate. He locked the door behind him, sat at his kitchen table, and pulled out his phone, dialing his attorney's number. Kimberly answered on the second ring. "I was expecting your call," she said, skipping the pleasantries. What did she do now? She put up a sign Richard said, voice even, claiming the land is under dispute. Says no one can enter without permission from the Ellis family. There was a beat of silence. Then Kimberly sighed. Classic move. She's trying to establish control before anything official is decided. She wants the town to start treating it like a real case instead of the nonsense it is. What's the next step? I'll send a cease and desist letter immediately, Kimberly said. And I'll follow up with the zoning office to make sure they're not entertaining this garbage. In the meantime, do not touch that sign. If you remove it, she can claim you're interfering with a legal process, and that gives her more leverage to stall. Richard exhaled, rubbing his temple. So I just leave it there, for now, Kimberly said. But we'll counter it in the official record, and if she keeps pulling stunts like this, we'll request an injunction to stop her from interfering with your land. Richard hated waiting. He had spent his life working in precise measurements, in data, in facts. There was no gray area in land surveying. A line was a line. Either something was within the boundary, or it wasn't. The idea that Karen could muddy something so cut and dry was infuriating, but he knew better than to let emotions guide his next move. Still, she wasn't done. That evening, as the sun cast long shadows over his property, Richard heard the distinct sound of an engine idling nearby. He stepped onto his porch, scanning the road. A dark SUV was parked just beyond his driveway, its windows tinted, the engine still running. It wasn't a neighbor's car. It wasn't anyone he recognized. And it wasn't moving. He watched it for a long moment, unmoving, his gut tightening with a feeling he didn't like. Then, slowly, the SUV pulled away, rolling down the road before disappearing around the bend. He stayed outside for a while after that, standing by his fence, feeling the weight of invisible eyes. The next morning, Karen made her next move. Richard had barely finished his first cup of coffee when he heard voices outside, low, measured, professional. Not Karen's voice. Someone else. He set his mug down, stepped outside, and immediately spotted them, two men in suits, standing just beyond his property line. One of them, tall with graying hair, held a leather folder in his hands. The other, younger, wore sunglasses and an expression so blank it might as well have been carved from stone. The older man smiled. "Mr. Cross," he said, as if they were old friends. "I'm Charles Fenwick. I represent the Ellis family in a legal capacity. We'd like to have a word." Richard studied them both, his expression unreadable. About what? Fenwick opened his folder, glancing at the documents inside before speaking. "Karen Ellis has expressed concerns regarding the boundary line between your properties. As I'm sure you're aware, historical land records can sometimes be imprecise. And local precedent plays a large role in cases like these. We'd like to find a reasonable solution before this becomes unnecessarily complicated." Richard crossed his arms, waiting. Fenwick continued. "The Ellis family is willing to offer a financial settlement in exchange for a portion of the land in question. A very generous offer, in fact." Richard raised an eyebrow. "She wants to buy my land." Fenwick smiled. "We'd like to avoid litigation if possible. A settlement would be the most efficient outcome for both parties." Richard let the silence stretch between them. He could see Karen watching from her porch, pretending to tend to her flower pots but very clearly listening. This wasn't about money. If it were, she would have made an offer weeks ago. No, this was about power. Control. She didn't want a piece of his land, she wanted the satisfaction of taking it. Richard exhaled through his nose. "I'll pass." Fenwick's smile didn't falter. "I understand. If you change your mind, I'll leave my card." He handed over a crisp business card, the name embossed in gold lettering. Richard didn't even glance at it. The men left, and Karen didn't look up as they walked past her porch. Richard stood there a moment longer, watching them drive away, then turned the card over in his fingers before tossing it into the trash. 2 nights later, his fence was cut, not knocked over, not damaged by weather or animals. Cut. A clean, deliberate break right where his land met Karen's. Richard found it early in the morning, a section of the wooden panels sliced neatly through, the pieces left scattered in the dirt. Not an accident. Made a message. He took pictures, sent them to Kimberly. "This is escalating," she said when she called him back. "She's trying to make it look like the boundary is open for dispute, that there's no real separation between the properties." "What do we do?" Richard asked. "You already filed a police report for trespassing, right?"
Yeah.
"File another one. And I'll add this to our injunction request." Richard repaired the fence that afternoon. This time he reinforced it with steel brackets. That night, the SUV was back. Richard watched from his window, his breath slow and controlled. The SUV didn't move for almost an hour, just sat there, engine running. He didn't call the police. They wouldn't do anything about a parked car on a public road. But the next morning, when he checked his property line, he found something new. Footprints. Leading from the fence to his yard. Someone had been here. Richard clenched his jaw, scanning the tree line. He wasn't going to let this continue. Karen wanted a war. She was about to get one. Richard wasn't a man who rattled easily. He had spent his career dealing with legal disputes over land, mediating between property owners who swore their neighbor's fence was 2 inches too far in one direction, untangling messy boundary claims that stretched back decades. He had learned that patience and precision were key, that the best way to win a land dispute was through meticulous documentation and an unshakable grip on the facts. But this wasn't a normal dispute. This wasn't a disagreement over a misplaced fence post or an outdated survey. This was Karen Ellis systematically trying to force him out, not through legal means but through psychological warfare, intimidation, and sheer persistence. She didn't care about who was right or wrong. She cared about exhausting him until he gave up and left. The next morning he drove back to the municipal zoning office. The same tired-looking clerk was at the front desk, barely looking up from her computer as he approached. He slid the file of documents across the counter. "I need to escalate my response to the boundary dispute," he said, his voice even but firm. The woman sighed, glancing at the paperwork. "You already submitted an opposition, Mr. Cross. It's in review." Richard shook his head. "I need a formal injunction filed against Karen Ellis to prevent any further interference with my land. She's vandalized my fence, she's had unauthorized surveyors on my property, and now she's planting signs that misrepresent legal boundaries. This isn't just a dispute anymore. It's harassment." The clerk's fingers hesitated over the keyboard. She looked up at him properly now, her brows knitting together. "You have evidence of this." Richard pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos his fence cut in half, the sign falsely claiming his land was under review, the fresh tire tracks and footprints leading onto his property. He placed the phone on the counter, letting her take a long look. She exhaled sharply. "Okay," she muttered. "Give me a minute." She disappeared into a back office, and when she returned, she wasn't alone. A man in a pressed button-down shirt followed her, a thick file tucked under his arm. He introduced himself as Andrew Carter, one of the senior officials in the zoning department. He took the file Richard had submitted and flipped through it with an unreadable expression. "We've been getting a lot of back-and-forth complaints between you and MS." Ellis Carter said, "I'm going to be honest with you, she's filed a lot of claims over the years. Most of them don't hold up under scrutiny, but she knows how to keep things tangled up in red tape." Richard folded his arms. "And you let her do this?" Carter gave him a tired look. "It's not that simple. As long as her filings follow procedure, we have to process them, even if we know they're frivolous. But what you're showing me here, that's different. This isn't just a dispute, this is an attempt to create a false legal precedent." He set the file down and leaned forward slightly. "I'll push this for priority review, and I'll get an official inspector out to document your land with county records. If we establish a solid enough case that Karen is deliberately falsifying boundary claims, We can file a recommendation to shut her case down permanently. But it's going to take time, and she's not going to stop just because we tell her to." Richard nodded slowly. It was the best outcome he could get for now, but he knew Carter was right. Karen had been playing this game for a long time, and she wasn't going to fold just because a zoning inspector told her to. She would escalate. And she did. 2 nights later, Richard was woken up by the sound of movement outside. It wasn't loud, just the faint crunch of gravel underfoot, but it was enough. He sat up, his senses sharpening, his mind instantly alert. He reached for the flashlight on his nightstand and moved quietly toward the window, pushing the curtain aside just enough to see the yard. A figure stood near the fence, tall, broad-shouldered, moving deliberately. Not Karen, her son Danny. Richard didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone and dialed the police. He kept his voice low, controlled. "There's someone trespassing on my property. I have an ongoing land dispute with a neighbor, and her son is currently in my yard near my fence. I need an officer here immediately." He didn't confront Danny. He stayed by the window, watching as the man paced along the fence line, occasionally bending down as if inspecting something. Was he looking for the security reinforcements Richard had installed? Was he planning to do more damage? It didn't matter. The police arrived within 15 minutes, their headlights sweeping across the property as they pulled in. Danny was caught in the beams, frozen for a brief moment before stepping back, lifting his hands in an exaggerated display of innocence. The officers questioned him. He played dumb, claiming he was just checking the land, that he grew up here and wanted to see how things had changed. The officers weren't buying it, but there was nothing they could arrest him for. He hadn't technically crossed onto Richard's land, just loitered right at the edge, towing the invisible line between legal and illegal. One of the officers, a no-nonsense woman named Officer Delgado, pulled Richard aside before leaving. "You need to be careful," she said. "This isn't a normal property dispute. They're trying to push you to make you react. Don't give them anything they can use against you." Richard nodded. He already knew that, but knowing didn't make it any less infuriating. The next morning, another envelope appeared in his mailbox. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper with bold, black letters. "You should reconsider." That was it. No signature, no threats, just a quiet, lingering message meant to worm its way under his skin. He took a picture of it, sent it to Kimberly. She called him immediately. "This is getting dangerous," she said, her voice tight. "You need to file another police report. This is intimidation." Richard hesitated. "It's vague. They'll say it's nothing." "It's not nothing," Kimberly snapped. "First the property claims, then the vandalism, then Danny showing up in the middle of the night, and now this? It's a pattern, Richard. You know that. You've seen it happen before to other people. We both know where this is going." She was right. He had seen cases like this before. People who refused to back down from their land, only for the pressure to ramp up until they either left or made a mistake that turned the law against them. That night he double-checked the locks on his doors, reinforced the windows, and made sure his cameras were recording properly. He wasn't leaving. He wasn't giving them what they wanted. But deep down he knew the worst was still coming. Richard had seen a lot of land disputes escalate over the years, but this was different. Karen and Danny weren't just pushing legal boundaries, they were actively trying to break him down, to make him second-guess his own rights, to wear him down with stress, fear, and intimidation. He had expected their tactics to ramp up, but the speed and precision with which they did so told him one thing: they weren't working alone. Someone was advising them, giving them just enough knowledge of the system to exploit every loophole, every bureaucratic delay, every opportunity to twist reality in their favor. It was a game of attrition, and they thought he would be the one to crack first. They were wrong. The next hit came 3 days after the last intimidation note appeared in his mailbox. This time it wasn't subtle. Richard woke up to find an official-looking letter taped to his front door, stamped with the county's insignia. He ripped it off and read it in one fluid motion, already feeling the heat of anger creeping up his spine. The document was a formal notice of investigation regarding unpermitted structures on his property. According to the letter, someone had filed a complaint alleging that modifications had been made to his house and land without the necessary approvals. The complaint specifically mentioned the fencing repairs he had made after Danny had vandalized it, as well as a supposed illegal outbuilding on his land. Richard knew it was garbage. Every repair he had done was minor, nothing that required permits, and there was no outbuilding on his property at all. It was a blatant attempt to tie him up in another layer of bureaucracy, to force him to spend time and resources fighting off an imaginary violation. He had seen this tactic before throw enough false allegations at someone, and sooner or later, one of them would stick just long enough to create a problem. He didn't waste time. He drove straight to the county office and requested to meet with whoever had signed off on the investigation notice. The man he was directed to, a younger official named Tyler Garrison, was already flipping through the case file when Richard walked into his office. "You got here fast," Garrison said, raising an eyebrow. "I just opened this file this morning." "Because it's nonsense," Richard said flatly, dropping a folder onto the desk. "There's no illegal outbuilding. The fence repairs were basic maintenance, well within regulations. This is a fraudulent complaint meant to waste my time." Garrison leaned back in his chair, studying him. "You're dealing with the Ellis case, aren't you?" Richard narrowed his eyes. "You know about it." Garrison exhaled through his nose. "I know Karen Ellis has filed more property-related complaints in this town than anyone else in the last decade. Some get dismissed immediately, some drag on for months, but she knows how to use the system. And she knows which buttons to push." Richard clenched his jaw. "So what happens now?" Garrison tapped the file. "Normally we'd have to send an inspector out to verify the claims. That means your property would be under review for at least a few weeks, possibly longer if Karen files additional complaints during the process." He paused. "But considering her history, I can expedite the dismissal if you allow a site visit today. If I confirm that none of these violations exist, I can close the case before it turns into another drawn-out battle." Richard didn't hesitate. "Do it." The inspection was over in less than an hour. Garrison walked the property, took some notes, snapped a few photos, and by the time they returned to Richard's front porch, he was already filling out the paperwork. "Nothing here constitutes a violation," he said. "I'll finalize the dismissal today. This particular attempt to harass you is over." Richard shook his hand, but the victory felt hollow. He knew Karen wouldn't stop just because this tactic had failed. She would regroup, find another angle, another way to undermine his ownership. He wasn't wrong. That night, at exactly 2:37 a.m., his security cameras captured two figures moving near the fence line. He didn't hear them at the time. He had finally managed to sleep through the night, exhausted from dealing with the county office all day, but when he reviewed the footage in the morning, his stomach tightened. Two men, both dressed in dark clothing, had approached his property from the road. They hadn't stepped onto his land, staying just outside the boundary, but they had lingered. One of them had a flashlight, the beam moving slowly over the fence, the ground, the property markers. The other took something out of his pocket, what looked like a small notepad, and wrote something down before they both turned and walked back to the road, disappearing into the darkness. Richard didn't need to guess who had sent them. He called the police immediately. The officers arrived within an hour, and by that time Richard had already downloaded the footage onto a flash drive, ready to hand over. Officer Delgado, the same no-nonsense woman who had responded when Danny had been caught loitering, reviewed the footage on the small screen of the patrol car's laptop, her expression growing darker with each passing second. "They weren't just snooping," she muttered. "They were documenting something, probably looking for another excuse to file a claim against you." Richard exhaled sharply, his hands tightening into fists. "What can we do?" Delgado glanced up at him. "I can file a report, log this as suspicious activity, but unless they actually stepped onto your property or committed a crime, there's not much else I can do." "Not yet," Richard said grimly. He knew it was only a matter of time before Karen made her next move. And she did. The very next morning he received an email from Kimberly. The subject line made his stomach drop: "Notice of legal action LSV. Cross." He opened it, scanning the attached documents. Karen had officially filed a lawsuit against him, claiming encroachment and property misrepresentation. She was alleging that Richard had intentionally built his fence beyond his rightful boundary, effectively stealing land that belonged to her family. The lawsuit demanded that the court grant her full access to the disputed portion of the property and require Richard to remove any structures that overlapped onto what she was now calling her ancestral land. Richard gritted his teeth. This was the move she had been waiting for. All the complaints, the intimidation, the manufactured disputes, they had all been leading up to this moment. She had been laying the groundwork to make it seem like she had a legitimate case, hoping to overwhelm him with legal fees, delays, and exhaustion. She wanted to break him financially and emotionally until he either gave in or ran out of money to fight. Kimberly's email was blunt. "This is bad, but not unwinnable. We need to counter this aggressively. I'll start drafting our response today, but we need to get ahead of this. Expect depositions, hearings, and a lot of legal maneuvering. This is going to be a war." Richard closed his laptop, inhaling deeply. He wasn't surprised, he wasn't even angry anymore. He was just tired. But tired didn't mean defeated. Karen thought she could drown him in paperwork, in stress, in legal games. But she had just made a critical mistake. She had underestimated how much fight he had left in him. Richard had spent his entire career dealing with land disputes, but this wasn't just a battle over property lines anymore. It was a calculated, relentless attack meant to break him down, to force him into either selling or making a mistake that Karen could twist into a legal victory. The lawsuit was her boldest move yet, a last-ditch attempt to rewrite reality through bureaucracy and manipulation. He knew the game she was playing: stalling tactics, fabricated evidence, drawing the case out for as long as possible until he either ran out of money to fight or gave up out of sheer exhaustion. But Karen had made one crucial mistake. She assumed he was like the others she had targeted in the past. She thought he would fold under the pressure. She was wrong. Kimberly had wasted no time in drafting a response. Their strategy was simple: attack the case at its weakest points. Karen's claims of ancestral land were meaningless without real evidence, and her accusations of encroachment fell apart the moment Richard's official land surveys were presented. But what made the case truly dangerous was Karen's ability to create confusion. She wasn't relying on facts, she was relying on doubt. If she could make the court believe that there was even a small chance of a legitimate dispute, the case could drag on for months or even years, and that was where the real battle lay. The first hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later. Richard arrived at the courthouse early, dressed in a suit he hadn't worn in years. He wasn't nervous, but he was angry in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. When he walked into the courtroom and saw Karen sitting at the plaintiff's table, wearing a pastel blazer and an expression of quiet confidence, he understood exactly what kind of show she was planning to put on. She wasn't here as an aggressor, she was here to play the role of the sweet, elderly woman being bullied by an unreasonable man. Karen's attorney was a middle-aged man with the kind of slick, rehearsed confidence that came from handling cases built on half-truths. He stood and addressed the judge with a carefully measured tone, explaining how Karen's family had lived in the area for generations, how the land had been understood to be part of their property long before Richard had ever moved in. He painted a picture of a grieving widow, a woman trying to protect the legacy of her family, only to be met with hostility and aggression. He spoke of community values, of historic understandings, carefully avoiding any concrete evidence because he knew he didn't have any. Then it was Kimberly's turn. She didn't waste time on theatrics. She presented the official land surveys, the deed, the historical records that clearly marked the property boundaries. She methodically dismantled every vague claim Karen had made, showing that there was no record, no legal precedent, no historical maps that supported her version of events. She pointed out Karen's long history of filing similar complaints against other neighbors, revealing a pattern of behavior that suggested this was not about land at all, it was about control. But the real turning point came when Richard's security footage was submitted as evidence. The video of Danny loitering near the fence in the middle of the night, the footage of 2 unknown men inspecting the property boundary without authorization, the still images of the vandalized fence, the intimidation notes left in his mailbox. It painted a picture Karen hadn't wanted the court to see, not of a kind, elderly woman trying to reclaim lost land, but of a woman orchestrating a campaign of harassment against her neighbor. Karen's attorney scrambled to object, claiming the footage was unrelated to the land dispute, but the judge allowed it. It was relevant because it showed intent. It showed that Karen had not simply filed a legal claim, she had engaged in a coordinated effort to make Richard feel unsafe in his own home. Karen's mask cracked for the first time that day. As the judge questioned her about the intimidation tactics, about why her son had been caught trespassing, about why she had hired surveyors to inspect land that wasn't hers, she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. For the first time, she wasn't in control of the narrative. The judge didn't dismiss the case outright, but he made it clear that Karen's claims were weak at best. A second hearing was scheduled for further review, but the damage had already been done. Karen had lost credibility. The case wasn't going the way she had planned, and she knew it. That night, Richard expected some kind of retaliation. He checked his security cameras, reinforced his locks, and waited. But nothing happened. Not that night. Not the next. Karen had gone silent, and that was more unsettling than any of her previous antics. Then a week later, something strange happened. Richard received a call from Kimberly, her voice tinged with a mix of amusement and exasperation. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Karen just filed a motion to drop the case." Richard frowned. "She's giving up." "Not exactly," Kimberly said. "She filed a secondary claim against the county, arguing that the zoning office mishandled property records. It's a desperate move. She knows she's losing, so she's trying to shift the blame onto the system itself." Richard exhaled slowly. He had expected her to fight, but he hadn't expected her to turn on the very bureaucracy she had been manipulating for years. It was a last-ditch effort, an attempt to keep the dispute alive by any means necessary. But it also meant one important thing: she was running out of options. The county rejected her claim within days. Without a solid legal foundation, her case crumbled. The judge officially dismissed her lawsuit, ruling in Richard's favor and reaffirming his property rights. It was over. Or at least it should have been. The night after the ruling, Richard was woken up by the sound of a car pulling into his driveway. He sat up immediately, adrenaline surging through his veins as he reached for the phone, ready to call the police. But when he looked outside, he didn't see a group of men or another act of vandalism. He saw Karen standing alone in his driveway, illuminated by the glow of his porch light. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Richard opened the door and stepped outside, keeping a safe distance between them. "What do you want?" Karen, his voice was calm, measured. She looked different. Smaller. Defeated. The confidence she had carried throughout the entire ordeal was gone, replaced by something hollow. "You ruined everything," she said quietly. Richard's jaw tightened. "No, you did." Karen shook her head, almost as if she didn't believe it. "I just wanted to keep what was ours. I just wanted—" She stopped herself, swallowing hard. Then, after a long pause, she turned and walked back to her car. She didn't say another word. Richard watched as she drove away, disappearing into the night. For the first time in months, the silence around his home felt like peace instead of anticipation. It was over. Karen Ellis had finally lost. In the days that followed Karen's sudden retreat, Richard felt the tension that had gripped his home for months begin to unravel. The silence was different now, no longer heavy with anticipation, no longer a waiting game to see what Karen would do next. It was just quiet. A quiet he had fought for. A quiet that felt earned. The lawsuit was over, dismissed by the court with finality, and there was no more paperwork, no more false claims, no more manufactured disputes clogging the system. The boundary line, the same one that had always been his, was reaffirmed, and with it, his right to enjoy his own damn property without fear of intrusion. Karen had lost. But victory didn't feel as satisfying as he thought it would. Karen had vanished from sight. She wasn't on her porch. She wasn't in her garden, pretending to tend to her flowers while watching him. There were no more letters in his mailbox, no more strange figures loitering by his fence at night. It was as if, after all the chaos she had stirred up, She had simply given up and disappeared into the walls of her house. For days, Richard barely saw movement next door, save for the occasional flicker of a light at night or the outline of her car still parked in the driveway. He didn't care enough to wonder what she was doing, but a part of him expected one last move, one final act of pettiness before she accepted her loss completely. But nothing came. Then, a for sale sign went up in Karen's front yard. Richard saw it early one morning when he stepped outside with his coffee, and for a moment he just stared at it, letting the realization sink in. She was leaving. After everything she had done, after all the effort she had put into trying to take what wasn't hers, she was walking away. He wondered if it had been her choice or if she had been forced into it. The legal fees alone must have been a heavy hit, and with her case publicly exposed as fraudulent, it wouldn't be surprising if she had decided that staying in the neighborhood wasn't worth the humiliation. He should have felt triumphant, but instead there was only a dull sense of inevitability. Karen had never been fighting for the land she had been fighting to win, and now that winning was no longer an option, she had no reason to stay. The house sat on the market for weeks. No one in town seemed eager to buy it, and Richard suspected the rumors about her antics had spread further than she realized. The idea of inheriting the mess she had created, of living next to the man she had tried to ruin, was probably unappealing to any potential buyers. There was something almost poetic about it, the way her own actions had tainted the very place she had fought so hard to control. She had turned her home into a battleground, and now no one wanted it, not even her. One evening, Richard was returning from town when he noticed Karen standing by her porch, watching the sunset. It was the first time he had seen her outside in weeks. There was no hostility in her posture, no trace of the smug confidence she had carried through their battle. She just looked tired. For a brief moment he considered stopping, saying something, acknowledging the finality of it all. But what was there to say? That he hoped she learned something from this? That he hoped she regretted it? He doubted she would ever see herself as the villain in this story. People like Karen never did. So he didn't stop. He just walked past her house, stepping onto his own land, the land that was his, the land that had always been his, and went inside. The day Karen moved out, Richard didn't watch. He heard the sounds of boxes being loaded into a moving truck, the occasional voice giving directions, but he never stepped outside to see her go. By the time he did, the for sale sign had a new label slapped across it, sold. And just like that, she was gone. The new owners moved in a month later. A young couple, quiet and polite. They introduced themselves the first day, shaking Richard's hand and thanking him for keeping an eye on the neighborhood. He didn't tell them about Karen, about what had happened before they arrived. It wasn't their burden to carry. Their only concern was that they were excited to start fresh, and Richard wasn't about to taint that with ghosts of a battle long since won. For the first time since moving in, his home felt truly his. The air felt lighter. The nights were peaceful. He no longer glanced at his fence every morning, expecting some new violation, some new act of sabotage. He didn't check his mailbox with a wary glance. The cameras around his house no longer felt necessary. The war was over. One evening, Richard stood at the edge of his land, looking out over the property that had caused so much trouble, the land Karen had tried to take from him. He thought about all the tactics she had used, all the manipulations, the legal loopholes, the intimidation. He thought about the months of stress, the endless fight just to hold on to what had always been his. And he thought about how, in the end, none of it had mattered. The law had sided with the truth. And the truth was, Karen had never stood a chance. Richard turned back toward his house, stepping inside as the sun dipped below the horizon. The world outside was still, quiet, untouched by conflict. And this time, he knew it would stay that way.